Hello, and welcome to a discussion on hard versus soft science fiction. I'm zeretulee,
And I'm Drezlor.
and let's kick this off with the simplest and most important of questions. What is science fiction? So I'll hand that over to you for a second.
Well, on the point of science fiction, for the most part, science fiction is fiction that is themed around science or technological things in general. On, imagined futuristic science technologies, advances, and other major social or environmental changes, frequently portraying space or time travel and life on other planets.
That's a pretty decent general explanation. Nothing really I can add to that. But the real question is, now the second question is, what makes a science fiction particularly hard?
Well, in the general case, when dealing with science fiction, people refer to science fiction that is, for more or less, portrayed using real math, or at least real theories, to generate the fictitious universe.
So an example, a good example for people is the universe The Expanse, which does a very good job of detailing a possible future for the real world. Yeah, where Mars and Earth are at war, and if they were to go to war, well, they're not at war, but if they were to go to war, they'd essentially wipe each other out with nukes. Which we'll come back to.
Yeah.
But before we go back to that for a second, let's just quickly define soft.
Well, in the most case, soft science fiction would come under science fiction works that go beyond our basic understandings of maths or science and tend to either invent their own or imagine the bits that fill in the gaps of the information that we have.
And a perfect pop culture example of this one is Star Wars.
Yes.
Star Wars is pretty soft compared to the previous example. So let's quickly.
Very much so. Very much so.
Yeah. So let's go down onto the hard side for a bit. Let's stick to that for a second. Okay, so how do you tell the difference between, or not the difference, but how do you tell if the universe that you're looking at is a hard science fiction universe? So go ahead with that.
Well, yeah. So the main way you can tell, in most cases, is a properly hard science fiction universe using real space mechanics tends to like the ships will have things like directional thrusters across the entire craft, so it can change directions, accelerate and decelerate, and they all tend to be kind of the same shapes. You can have others, but they tend to be the same ones, vaguely cylinder-like or kind of like flattish shapes and stuff like that. So yeah, that's the main way.
That's the general way. Now there are some things that, though are used, there are worlds that have used them. They don't really extrapolate very well on it. For example, fighters, the concept of space fighters. You can find examples of real space or hard science fiction things that will try to use them, but the extrapolation tends to fall short on the sort of mechanics of them, and they tend to be being used solely without any sort of around to them, they tend to be the main focus. Because when they're not, you know, an example of this would be like Battlestar Galactica, where they're the focus. The fact that there are fighters and that this ship is a carrier is the focus of the thing. They don't really have, like, you know, it's these interceptor missiles because... In fact, do you want to explain why missiles really make fighters, like... They take fighters out of the picture for hard science fiction?
Yeah, because particularly with fighter craft, in the conventional sense, you know, small 1 or 2 man piloted craft, a missile with multi-directional thrusters can easily follow and take out a fighter with almost excellent ease. And, well, because of the extreme engaged distances you'll generally find in hard science fiction, it's just easier to shoot people with missiles than it would be to send a fighter that would have to fly for, you know, minutes to hours to get to its destination.
Not only that as well, but one of the other things that I saw somebody else talking about on this, which is a very, very good thing to point out, is that fighters can't really dodge missiles in like vacuum.
Yeah, not particularly well. At least.
Like, yeah, there may be some room for it, but generally the problem comes in with sort of thrust to mass. For like a fighter, the mass is much higher and the thrust will be lower relative, which means any correctional movements to dodge the missile the fighter could make, the missile will always make better. Which means that if the missile has locked onto you, that's pretty much game over. You really cannot do that. So if anyone, say, if the Cylons in Battlestar Galactica decided that they could just produce lock-on missiles to take out Vipers, they'd just take out all the Vipers. There wouldn't be any Vipers.
Yeah, particularly on a fighter craft that has no means of point defense, which is why, more reasonably, you would be using pretty much things from Corvette class and up, because they're large enough to have point defense weapons on them that function appropriately. But they also wouldn't operate like fighters, so...
Yeah, which is, in The Expanse is another, just to bring up The Expanse again, because I enjoyed that one.
Yeah, Expanse is a very good example of very well done hard science fiction, for the most part.
Because, yeah, there aren't fighters in The Expanse, because they don't work in real space. Because...
Not to a high enough efficiency to make them worth it, at least.
Yeah. Well, you could build them like you could build a Raptor from Battlestar Galactica. You could build one, and it would do what it says on the tin. It's just, if you put that into an actual military context...
Yeah, more...
Any sort of... Yeah, any innovation is probably just going to kill it, and it's just going to be replaced with either a missile or a bigger ship.
Yeah. Which most part ends up being more useful.
You mentioned the engagement range as well. Do you want to elaborate on the engagement range?
Yeah. This is a particular thing that a lot of science fictions that are trying to be hard science fictions or harder science fictions.
Yeah, because it's a scale thing. You can be not absolute either way.
Yeah. Tend to overlook is engagement ranges and what they'd realistically be, which would drastically affect what weapons you could actually use. Like an extreme example of a science fiction series that keeps kind of screwing up their engagement distances, though if you look at it critically, it's more soft science fiction, but a lot of people have tried to claim it's a hard science fiction that just kind of throws in wacky shit, is Star Trek.
Oh, yeah.
Star Trek, particularly like Next Generation and shit, they bring up engagement distances a lot, and in many instances, they're talking about distances of, like, say, 200 miles and such, which is something they actually, one specific instance, keep 200 miles distance or whatever. The actual, they have it so you can see the entire ships, which you could probably kind of hand wave that sort of.
Yeah, you
by,
will, because they use
you know,
view screens. You'd expect that they're just kind of projecting it or something.
Got cameras and stuff, but if you take it at face value, because that's never actually explained, and they're actually seeing them realistically, like in any realistic context, 200 miles is far enough that you could not reasonably, with the naked eye, see a ship that is, you know, only a couple kilometers long. You just couldn't. It would look like a fucking speck.
Yeah, it would be like playing. It would be like. It's like trying to fire ping pong balls at like distant planets. That's the sort of thing you're doing.
Yeah, like a great example I saw in a video that I watched a little while ago. They took an image of a roughly 1 kilometer long aircraft carrier, from a Google Earth image in one of the ports in America, and then zoomed out 200 miles on like the Google Earth or whatever it is, the one that you can zoom out into space.
Yeah.
And zoomed out 200 miles, and that's like the distance that you can, like, way out there. You can see the Earth is round at that distance. You can see the round shape to it.
Yeah.
You can't make out that ship. You can't even see the city that the ship's in at that range. So that affects weapons in a very, very problematic way.
Yeah, like try and attach like your beam gun. Try and attach like a laser pointer to the side of a satellite and have it try and tag a ship that on Earth. Have fun.
Yeah, like lasers, laser weapons, like actual beam weapons, not like lasers from other science fiction, like proper. You know, you fire it, it's a beam that damages shit.
Yeah.
That would be so irritatingly difficult to target. You could still do it at that range. Unlike more conventional weapons we have now, like standard weapons, and the go-to weapon that everyone loves in modern science fiction now, the current things, rail guns and stuff. Any projectile weapon that fires a single, not self-propelling projectile would not, by any reasonable level, be able to hit anything at that range. Maybe if it's massive, we're talking like, you know, big like Star Wars dreadnought size ships. Yeah, you might be able to hit one of those with a railgun at those ranges, but not like singular 1 kilometer ships. You're just not going to be able to hit those. So it really only ends up leaving you with, you know, one option. It's missiles or rockets or whatever you want to call them.
Yeah.
Technically,
Guided
at that level,
projectile.
they'd be more like drones with explosives strapped to them. But
yeah, nuke drones is a common one.
But yeah, with the ability to correct their own course to adjust for the like the actual delay that you would be receiving in that distance, because the delay of seeing something at that distance is, I think it's a bit over a second.
Oh yeah, well that's when you actually get into light seconds and stuff. It was Mass Effect that actually defined their engagement ranges by the actual light distance. I think their max range was like a light minute or something.
Yeah, I something like that. I didn't end up paying attention to a lot of that Mass Effect. But yeah, no, it was something along those lines, which is particularly irritating, at least in Mass Effect's case, because pretty much all of their primary weapon systems are projectile weapons.
Yeah, no, it's like spray and play. It is spray and praying, but with a sniper rifle is essentially what they're trying to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you never actually get to see those kind of engagement ranges I would like to bring up some of the space battles you see, right? Like the one in Mass Effect 3 above Earth with the Reapers. The actual distances that they're engaging in that would be in the hundreds of miles at some points, because you can see when the ships come in, the actual distance that you are from the Earth and stuff. It's massive. That would be at least in the singular 100 plus distances. But all the ships, you can like see them. It's a scale thing. Makes it look way better. But,
yeah,
you know,
it's more cinematic.
Luckily, Mass Effect's not one of the ones trying to be particularly hard, because they fall in the more having fun with science fiction than trying to force just realistic outcomes.
Yeah. Yeah, it would look far less. Although I will say The Expanse again, because The Expanse is sort of my best example for this. Where it comes to realistic engagement ranges, when they describe those sorts of things and show them on screen, they don't. Maybe they'll cut to the missile itself, just the missile moving, or something to give it sort of that cinematic edge. But everything's essentially like a game of Battleship, because that's what combat in hard science fiction universes, or using real space in general.
Yeah,
it really just comes down to essentially playing a game of Battleship, where he's over there, I'm over here, we're going to pot shot each other until something hits. And most of the time, especially in really hard stuff, the tech isn't exactly... It isn't like the fantastical stuff that you'd get out of Star Wars. If you get pinged in the wrong spot, that's the ship dead. That's the ship and its crew, and everyone is dead. So it's... Much like
really any vehicle, if you get pegged in the wrong spot, you are you're done for.
Yeah, there's no shields. There's just ping, dead. If I shoot a hole through you with my railgun, it's going so fast, you're going to need a lot of armor to stop that, and you can't have a lot of armor.
Yeah, or you get hit, just dead on with a nuclear warheaded fucking missile.
Yeah.
That's either 90% of your ship is going to be worthless, and you might have a few crew quarters left or something with some people living, without being able to survive in them, or the ship's just going to be dead, just full stop dead. It's not even a decompression issue at that point. It's just the entire structure of the ship's compromised.
Yeah. Well, no, just imagining what a shrapnel round will do to something like that. You just explodes before it gets there, and there's fragments of like sand just cut the ship up like cheese. Oh,
actually, that's interesting, because that's reasonably one of the few kind of induction weapons that could work. One that just fires, like a steel sand at a fraction of the speed of light towards a ship.
That's essentially what they're doing in Mass Effect.
For some of Mass Effect, is using the whole what is it?
The Mass Effect field, which is what it was, the whole ESO thing.
Yeah. They're using like pinky nail-sized shards of metal being launched at fucking ridiculous speeds using gravity manipulation.
Oh, the havoc. But yeah, generally, it's this sort of conundrum that sort of brings in this sort of this sort of problem that I see. I think both of us have seen quite a few people have, who try and make worlds like this, with like going as hard as you can go, or going pretty decently hard, is you tend to wind up with any sort of story has to be set on a planet, or it can get pretty samey and dull pretty quickly, because
it really has to be focused on the people and not the rest of it, because reasonably unless you're one of those people that specifically likes combat like that, it's not particularly exciting combat. You know, sitting at distances you can't see the other ship, firing volleys of missiles or metal stand at people hoping you'll hit.
Yeah, it's the sort of combat that could be easily simulated on something like an NES. Like, you just have some squares on the screen, and that's where the enemy is, and you try and peg the square a couple times until it goes away. That's really all of it. All it really chalks down to.
It's actually one of the few semi realistic things you get from things like Gundam and a lot of the space mecha. Is they just use inordinate amounts of missiles, and that would be very accurate to actual real space combat. Just inordinate amounts of missiles.
You heard it here first, folks. Gundam is realistic.
At least one facet of it.
Yeah.
The rest of it kind of goes down the toilet, but that's being safe. Soft science fiction bit.
Oh boy. But yeah, no, like, options wise, it can be really limiting. Because again, it just really the extrapolation of it comes down to how many missiles I got. I've seen people try and essentially use certain technological advances to make it more like what we call fluid space, where you slow down stuff. But we'll discuss
like gravity manipulation. And stuff.
But we'll discuss that when we get to soft. The last thing I want to bring up on the subject of hard at the moment is planets. The sort of relation between planets and getting off of them, and that sort of stuff. Planet relation stuff.
Oh that's arguably, aside from the space mechanic component, like if you cut the space mechanics component, the way planets work in general, like on a large scale, on a large to medium scale at least, changes drastically. Like, using a hard science fiction world, you can't really have big ships that go from planet to space. You can't really have any ships that can really do that properly, because the amount of energy required to actually escape a planet's gravity and get to space is so high, it's not funny. Which means you'd need massive thrusters able to lift the ship into space, and you couldn't reasonably have that on an actual spacecraft. So you'd need to find other methods to circumvent that, which then leads to what I like to call a softer hard science fiction, which is when you start adding in things that we don't know if they're actually possible, but theoretically they are, like space elevators and stuff. That eases a lot of those issues, or space stations on the moon, and then kind of just starting to have people live in space and stuff. But for the most part, just if you build a ship for space, it's not going to be able to go between land and space, which is in softer science fictions that use mechanics like fluid space. That's not as much of an issue.
Yeah. Oh yeah, no. Well, not to mention, well, actually, to mention, because that's kind of the point. In any sort of war story, you're obviously going to have to take territory, but when it comes to taking planets in hard science fiction settings, you wind up with the sort of combat options limitation that you get with ship to ship bleeding over to planets, because you can't just kind of land people. You're just dropping them from orbit. There are solutions I've seen to this, and there are some solutions I can think of now, but for the most part, anything that you're trying to get down onto the planet is going to be a different thing to what gets the thing up off of the planet. The Expanse does something interesting, but I don't know the details on it. Which they have these boxes that people go in that decelerate them as they go down to the Earth, and then accelerate itself back up into the space. I'm not sure how they do that. I don't know about the details of that, but I guess you could do something like that. But
Well, mechanically, I would imagine the box would carry the fuel to get back up, and then it just kind of has enough fuel to slow down, and then just kind of free falls until it slows down with a small thrust, drop the person off, and then shoot back up with the remaining fuel it has. That seems like a very... I guess if you're at the point where fuel really isn't a concern, you know, like...
Oh yeah, in their case, like the I don't know if you can use an Epstein drive in a planet without setting the atmosphere on fire. I don't know if that was an overlooked thing, but I'm sure the engine technology in that universe was pretty good.
Even if you're using the nuclear engines that they designed in the... What was it? I think it was the 70s? I can't remember.
Oh, what, like the bomb ones?
The ones that just essentially creating small nuclear explosions out the
yeah, the bomb ones. The ones that they weren't allowed to use because they would create EMPs that would shut off power grids.
Yeah, but you could feasibly make a small enough one of those just for getting back up, getting an empty box back up into space.
Yeah.
And that would be incredibly low on fuel. You know, you would need a small palmful amount of fissionable material to get it back up there. And you would need a shielded cone for the explosion to go off in to get it up. The only issue with that is it's particularly hard to control. But beside the point in general. Yeah, the getting down and up into space thing's a problem. Particularly in the case of warfare.
Yeah, because you're going to get your box shot down as it tries to decelerate.
Yeah. Well, the first biggest issue that comes to at least narratives and such in real space worlds is for the most part, controlling the orbital controls the planet, really.
Yeah. I've actually heard that phrase specifically parroted by people as well.
Yeah, that phrase is very accurate. I'd imagine many people would use it. You control the orbitals to control the planet, which is true particularly if you're in real space, because who can really fight back if you're just going to rain missiles on it,
You don't even have to do missiles as well, because just the gravity of Earth is enough for you to fire. Just drop tungsten rods at the Earth, and that'll do it.
Yeah,
you're essentially just dropping nukes at that point.
Yeah, it's quite a real point, but the only real counter that you can have to that is surface to orbit missile batteries, which, assuming if it's an advanced enough stellar civilization, they would have those. And in that case, your technology for getting people down, right, would be essentially dropping people in with, say, kind of Starship Troopers, like the movie Starship Troopers, kind of like just a box with a kind of ship thing that just has engines that falls from orbit.
Yeah.
Like a big old shipping container full of people, which is, perfectly serviceable for that. But getting back up there is always the concern. But assuming you're running a real space thing, the cities would have, essentially starports at that point to launch things back up.
See, yeah, no,
so
even
with essentially use the resources you steal to get back up.
Yeah, but one of the issues that generally comes out of that, and I've seen people do this in roleplay things, where you'll have a planetary defense, and it's like, oh yeah, if you come near my planet, I'll just fire missiles at you or something. Or I have a railgun that will fire at you. They'll just sort of bring up the engagement range problem comes back up, where the planet's engagement range will probably be lower than the ship's one. The ship can just figure out where you are and then lob stuff at you, especially if they don't need you.
That's most definitely true, but it also stands to reason that the planet's detection range would be far greater than the ship's, giving more time to circumvent and destroy the incoming missiles.
What about kinetic kill vehicles, though?
Sorry, what was that?
What about kinetic kill vehicles? Like the rounds of a railgun or something? Like, you just have a thing that goes really far. Like, move something up to relativistic speeds and essentially just slam it into the planet from, like, Mars distance.
Even in that case, if it's coming from a ship, unless the railgun is massive, like you're firing, like, kind of person-sized projectiles, if a person kind of crouched down and kind of huddled up, unless you're firing, like, person-sized projectiles at the planet, there's a reasonable thing that it probably would not actually end up doing that much damage. You might be able to take out a few houses with a thing. If you're hitting a city, you could probably fuck up some large buildings. But as far as small military structures and that, your accuracy would not be able to pinpoint a bunker at that range.
You just have to kind of spray the bunker area.
You might even not be able to pick up that there's a bunker there. A city's something that you could see from space, particularly at night. But like a military bunker that the only bit sticking out of the top of it, or even a military base, is like 5 buildings that are, a few dozen to a few hundred meters in total square footage and stuff.
Yeah, you're not thinking about the Star Trek. Like, there are thousands. You can barely see this kilometer-long thing from that distance. Trying to pick out a bunker entrance from that distance.
Yeah, you're just not going to do it, which is why circumventing planet-based missile defenses are incredibly difficult. Which is why it's easier to just get a smaller object onto the planet and deploy troops. Yeah. Which is where, most of your narrative would probably be coming from. And then getting them back up. But you kind of have to have these specific setups to make this work, because otherwise, you could just drive by nuclear warheads, spam a few colonies and wipe them out. And
colonies is the best way to put that as well, is colonies, because sort of low population worlds won't have the infrastructure in place to put these defenses on the ground.
Yeah.
So they're just going to be open season for the drive-by nuking.
And then on the other point, things like stations, which would be the other big conflict bit, that comes down to 2 options. Either you have to take it with, essentially ground forces because you want to keep the station, because that would be expensive to build, or alternatively, the station would have greater military capabilities than your ship because it gets to be larger being a stationary object.
Yeah.
Or relatively stationary object.
Well then, I think that's a pretty good overview for the hard science fiction section. Unless we want to quickly brush on the sort of tech bracketing.
Yeah. One thing I would like to bring up, particularly with the definitions surrounding science fiction and stuff, and hard science fiction. I've been in a lot of science fiction communities, so have you, Tully.
Yeah. Yep.
One of the constant things that come up is, though people keep, wanting to go hard science fiction, there's a lot of kind of grey area where people don't agree on what it is. They're like, it has to be realistic, but people, to kind of suit narrative points, have to include other things. Like, if you want to go to other solar systems and stuff readily, you have to include a FTL mechanism. And, that's not very hard science fiction, just because, we've never been able to actually do it or anything like that. And even the theories are a bit shaky at the moment. Like, they should work.
Like the warp drive, I saw when I looked at the thing for the warp drive, the actual results of actually trying to use that machine at the moment would be everything inside the ship or everything inside the warp bubble would melt. Instantly just like vaporize. So, yeah.
They work in theory.
Yeah.
Not in practice.
The wormhole one is only it requires things that we don't know how to acquire. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you tend to have to bend it a little bit.
Under those circumstances, you kind of can bracket into like between 3 and 5 groups, depending on how far you want to go. The first 3, which are the kind of 3 from the middle, because the other end is the different layers of soft science fiction. The first 3 would just be considered hard science fiction, and you kind of go down that list from like kind of, I would say, sort of Halo-y, but Halo's laws are a little inconsistent. They operate a lot like they have soft science fiction, like fluid space mechanics, but then they also give law reasons why they don't have those.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of argument between, you either go with what the law says or you go with what it exactly looks like. So that depends on how you want to go. But like Halo's the one that's straddling like the edge of that. So
yeah, well,
it
like
is
you can see
realistic.
like the lack of maneuvering thrusters and the fact that the fighters always go forwards and stuff really kind of make...
Actually, they treat fighters pretty well in that, considering the opponents that they're fighting and the weapons that they have available. It's not that bad, but they kind of cut out the engagement range thing and all that. So that's kind of on the farthest right. And then you go a bit further to the left, and you start running into things like, say, Starship Troopers and stuff. They're trying to... this generally fills the category of a lot of military fiction, is what people call it, or military science fiction. Because, you gotta have narrative reasons for a lot of stuff to happen, so you kind of need people to get around quickly, or you need, some kind of weapon that doesn't exist, stuff like that you can't really use. So it's hard science fiction in the sense that the majority of it is just outright hard science fiction, but a lot of it isn't for narrative reasons. And then you get a bit further to the left, and then this is the real hard straddling section, because then the next 2 after this kind of go into the what would be called the extremist kind of categories. So in this one, you have things like what would you call it? It's like hard science fiction things that like just have things like FTL and stuff, things that you kind of need to make a galaxy spanning thing. They tend to only go as far as things that are theoretical. They don't tend to straddle on the really theoretical. They kind of go, oh yeah, this is a system that's proposed and most people believe it, so we can go with that. And then the ones left of that is where I would say hard science fiction stops being a thing, and it more becomes things like what I'd like to call futurist fiction.
Okay.
Not to actually be associated with things like futurists as in the philosophers and stuff. Yeah. Futurist science fiction, futurist fiction instead of science fiction is no longer is the science the main theme of it, but it tends to be more the operating within a realistic setting that becomes more of the concern of it. Like Expanse?
Yeah, the Expanse.
That would be in like the first bracket of that. Just after you've left the science fiction bit, you're still operating, well within, you're fighting in space and stuff and all that, like regularly. But you're still adhering, as close as you could really get to being real without, super compromising your ability to storytell.
And
then
I'm trying to think of things that aren't like, because the realism in that is, as far as I could tell, like pretty much spot on, apart from obviously inventing the new drive. Except for the alien. The alien, that's different. That thing is that thing's not even explained. It just kind of is there and breaks the rules. Yeah. So
there are some things there. They're operating with almost absolutely real mechanics, but they're still in a heavily like you could use the word abstract. It's not accurate, but something that you could clearly still see is not spot on real. Because there has to be some concessions. not massive ones, but they're just little ones that are around the place. And then the furthest to left is the true futurist fiction, or true hard fiction,
like
hard science.
I'm trying to think of one now.
Where that one is pretty much where I use the term futurist fiction the most, in which it is fiction just depicting an immediate future.
Like what kind of series?
There's not particularly a lot of things done in this because done in this kind of setting, because it would be practically the same conceptually as modern life, but we're just going to other places. Like The Martian would be futurist fiction.
Yeah, actually, no, that's a pretty good example.
Yeah, so they're able to get to places that we have yet to go, which makes it more fiction, but they're using, by fundamentals at least, entirely real, already mathed out everything.
Yeah. Well then, I think that does it for hard. And now let's go over the soft side. So let's get this over here. So, what's soft? We've already discussed that hard is trying to tip the realism scale, up as far as we can kind of get it, and it's that sort of high realism area.
Yeah, well, soft science fiction, also I'd say on a scale of 3 to 5, goes the other direction, in which it is focusing more on the fiction bit of it, but they're still maintaining the scientific theme. So
yeah,
things are still trying to be scientific, and there's still science. There's still meant to be science there and stuff. Which you see most things that come under science fiction are just straight up in these categories. Like, good 80% of all the science fiction out there would be in soft, just because, for the most part, it functions more for a narrative. It makes it easier to write a narrative in it, because you don't have to worry about as keeping realism like that as much as you do with the concept of hard science fiction, or the realisticness, because realism's a bit off of a term.
Yeah. Well, see, one of the interesting conflations, actually, and I kind of did it then a minute ago, is that often realism is attributed to not things that. Well, realism is attributed to things that are real. So the closer you are to real, the more realistic something is. But that's not really what the word means. It more refers to how something would behave were it real. Because if it isn't real, it can't be realistic if you treat it the other way. You'd need to treat it as how it would work were it real. As realistic.
That would make it realistic.
Yeah.
As in having a sensible, practical idea of what can be achieved or expected.
Yeah, like heavy sort of hard science fiction. I'm going to say pundit, because I think that's the right word. But don't quote me on that. But those the people that really like hard science fiction and sort of in a sort of this is superior sort of way, generally will refer to things as realistic if they reflect the real world, not if they worked within the rules provided. Because if you were to take a fictional device that is logically sound, like it follows all the rules of its world fine, and then you take it into the real world with the rules being intact, it will work. Whereas, a good example of the opposite of this is Star Trek, where if you take anything out of, but virtually anything out of it, it doesn't work anymore because there aren't any consistent rules for it.
Yeah. There's
I think that
no critique. that
I think that's
rules the
right
Star
at the edge of the scale.
Actually, no.
Oh, really?
There's more to the scale than that, yeah. Unfortunately. But yeah, for the most part, on the point of realistic versus realism, realism would be depicting something in a purely real-to-life way.
Yeah.
Where something is realistic would be something that you could believe is real, at least in its own universe.
Yeah. Like.
So, just want to get
Mass Effect is a good example of that conflation, because though it's not realism, it's realistic. If Element Zero was a thing, it would work like that. You could do those things with it.
For the most part, there are still some people in that series that act like they're made of plastic, which a big part of realism is capturing, a living creature's kind of identity in it and making them appear real. That's a big part to realism, and explain. If you have a gun that loads a magazine into it in a weird place and it doesn't look like the rounds or the cartridges or whatever couldn't get to the actual, feeding and firing mechanism, that would be entirely unrealistic. But you can have an entirely artificial gun, something from science fiction, as long as it looks like it would work perfectly, you can see how the mechanics would function in it. That would be realistic of it.
Yeah.
So yeah, back to soft science fiction. One of the biggest components in that, for the most part, which goes across most of the categories, most of the segments, is the concept of fluid space.
Yes.
Which
that shifts the balance in a lot of ways, and it's an interesting thing. I had an argument with someone a while ago about how realistic it as a concept is, and I wound up just like, they wouldn't let up as much as I would sort of give them. I would give them examples of things in our world that kind of mirror its effects to a degree, and they weren't taking it. So in the end, I did the math, and I know it works. I know it works now. I may put that somewhere in here later. I might put that up on the screen now or something to sort of show what I did to sort of prove that the basic concept of it does actually function.
Yeah, and I'll just like to clarify, because you didn't make much clarification of that. He doesn't mean it functions in the fact that it's real. Just as a concept, it's not just a hand waving concept. It's
as
one
much
that
as
you
people
can
want
actually
to say.
work the math out for, and it functions.
Yeah, it's a. I guess by this point I can solidly say it's a mathematically solid concept.
Yeah, for the most part, because there has to be some concessions with the different types. But we will be touching more on fluid space in its own video, so we're just going to give a brief overview now of what is fluid space and why the name is a little bit misleading. So the premise of fluid space overall is, first I would like to mention that a lot of universes use what we call fluid space mechanics, but they don't explicitly themselves state anything of the such.
Star Wars used to on its wiki say it did, but that page has vanished now, so I don't know what happened to that. But it sort of explicitly stated that it did to a degree.
It's probably because that was expanded universe stuff, and so they probably just
probably flushed it out with the rest.
Yeah. But for the most part, a lot of universes use it, but they don't explicitly state they use it, because it's not really a massively shared concept.
Yeah.
Because
not to mention that. Yeah, not to mention that some people will sort of frown upon the concept of doing too much to space like that, because a lot of some of the people I've spoken to in the past will say things like, it doesn't feel like space anymore. I used to be like that, and I switched over a while back because of some of the things we're going to explain in a minute.
It is an issue for people, because people do like space as space, because it's an imagination thing, and I can definitely appreciate that. But I'm very much in for narratives and inventive creating, which is why I, for a lot, not everything I do, lean towards fluid space, which, going back to the overview, the main thing about fluid space is space, for the most part, will act like it has a medium there. Not particularly fluid, or, fluid mechanics. It just acts as if there's a medium. You can have a whole different range of them. It's kind of a general term. It can act like space is full of water in some cases, or just like it has air. The main bit of it is it will offer resistance. And because of this, the main effects of it is it will shorten engagement distances drastically, because anything you fire will require significantly more fuel to fight against the resistance to get to its target, so shorter engagement ranges become more practical.
Yeah.
And it also allows fighters to become useful, because dogfighting then becomes an actually usable mechanic.
Yeah, because the missile problem goes away to a degree.
The missile problem goes away because you can rapidly bank and the missile kind of squirrels off and stuff. It would just come down to like dealing with missiles in an atmosphere.
Yeah. But yes, that's really what it winds up being. It winds up being an atmosphere, but bigger. And depending on how it's done, depends on the properties. Because sometimes, actually, we'll just explain that in the other video.
Yeah, we'll explain that in the fluid space video. But to just cap off the fluid space thing, most of the really popular like science fiction things use fluid space mechanics. Some of the larger, more notable ones are things like Star Wars uses it, Star Trek, for a lot of what it does, uses it, but because of the narrative inconsistencies with Star Trek and its functions, you can't really claim it uses any type of space, one or the other.
Yeah.
Because Star Trek is inconsistent. Good storytelling, but inconsistent science. Other good ones is Mass Effect simulates fluid space mechanics using its engine types, by manipulating gravity and such. Halo does the same thing in a lot of components. And the way you can generally tell fluid space is the lack of directional thrusters and having very large thrusters at the back of the ship.
Yeah, because they don't really have to worry about, reversing the thrust to slow down anymore. Because space will do that for them.
You don't have to worry about slowing down, because you're already being slowed down. And you turn by just applying more energy on one side or the other of the engine, like steering a boat.
Yeah.
Or a plane. So you can bank and pitch and yaw and stuff.
So, let's quickly go over the sort of soft science fiction in general, pros and cons. Pros first and cons last, like we did with hard. One of them...
We didn't really... How about we do pros and cons for both of them, like just a list at the end?
Fair enough, I guess. We can just sort of discuss in general.
Soft science fiction in general thing. So, the most part with soft science fiction is it tends to be the more science fiction of the two groups, because, you end up having things like lasers and, just regularly being used. And on the scale, so this also broken up into 3 and then 2, so 2 on the far side and 3 closer to the middle. In the first 3, it's kind of how far you diverge from it. So in the first one, it kind of mirrors the first of the hard science fiction ones, in which you make a lot of narrative concessions and stuff. So you end up having, things like shields and fast and light travel. Then you start getting ships of kind of weird shapes that you wouldn't have otherwise, ships with wings and stuff, which would be, for the most part, in real space, kind of pointless. And then you get to an example of a universe that's in the kind of like first tier of fluid space is Warhammer 40k. It's kind of in between the first and second tier.
You mean soft sci-fi?
Yes, soft science fiction. Yeah, Warhammer 40k is in between the first two of soft science fiction. For the most part, that is. And then you get to the second tier. The second tier is where you kind of start getting to the... it's where the weapons kind of diverge in a greater manner, because people will circumvent things for greater, like, power sources or other elements and stuff to start inventing things. It's where things kind of get really invented. Most science fiction, soft science fiction that is, sits in the second bracket. Like, you'll find Star Wars is in there, minus most space operas are in there, like Dune and all that. They're all in the kind of second one, minus a couple of their elements that you wouldn't really count as part of the science fiction and more a consequence of a space opera, like the Force and stuff. Because if you take just the face value of the Star Wars series, the games and the movies, it kind of just sits comfortably in 2, a little bit on 3. But then when you include the expanded universe and all the other stuff and the TV shows, it kind of starts moving into like between 2 and 4. You know, just because the inclusion of Space Wizards. And then you get to the third one. The third one is where stuff just starts getting, you know, kind of out there-ish. It's where you get things like what do you call it? Can't remember the name.
Describe it to me.
Well, like, Mass Effect kind of sits in the third one a bit with a lot of the things that exist in the universe itself, but that's more due to narrative complications than actual mechanics.
Mm.
And then you have... that's where I was going. Things like Fallout and stuff. Fallout, though technically not straight up science fiction, has massive science fiction elements all the way through it, sits firmly in the third one because of just the massive jump in kind of technological development that they have. And it puts them in a quite entertaining position, because I'd say 2 and 3 are like the most comfortable positions for it to sit in, because it's before you start getting to the frankly ridiculous things, but you're not quite, but you have enough room that you can, you know, play with concepts and you know, really add stuff of your own. Also, the third position is where most science fiction games end up sitting, because game mechanics also have to influence the universe. Like StarCraft, that's what I was trying to think of earlier. StarCraft is in the third category because of how much more kind of soft science fiction it is overall.
Yeah.
And then after the third point,
some of the armor types deflecting some of the rounds they're using here. You can start to see where the realism bit drops off.
Yeah. You start getting into the one of their soldiers outdoes the entire U.S. military. You start getting to that zone.
Yeah. Just one Goliath.
Yeah, a Goliath and four Terran Marines just kind of take over the United States.
Yeah, let alone a Goliath rush.
But then you move on to the last two, which what I like to call for the most part science fantasy. Less of an accurate term, because you can apply science fantasy to any of the science fiction categories, plus a functioning magic system. If your magic is more, you know, realistic, like you're working out energy conversion, maths, and all kind of stuff like that.
Yeah.
You can probably put it closer to like the first two of the hard science fiction. Probably just the first for the most part. where if you leave your magical vague and stuff and put it further on the right, but or you could call it science lunacy. Now, Star Trek, because of its because of how inconsistent Star Trek is, it sits firmly in like position 4, and these are generally where the best stories are told. I have to admit, like the best science fictions that have like the best like episode to episode stories. Doctor Who's also in the 4th position. They're just fun to watch. Like they're really entertaining, but they're very very lax on the even realism. This is where kind of realism starts falling off.
Yeah, no, it's when this is like personally, it kind of switched me off of Doctor Who, where the consistency isn't really something. Like, consistency and realism, not in the sense we describe the sort of realisticity where things have rules they work by. There is a consistent set of rules that govern this universe. This sort of area, I can like these 2 series we've just mentioned are perfect examples of this, where it just kind of falls flat because they don't the people running it don't care. It's more about the story, the individual story that's happening right now that matters. It's not the overarching thing is meaningless. So you'll wind up with one episode. One episode, the sonic screwdriver can open a door, and then the next episode, he walks up to a door and it's locked and goes, well, we can't go in there, the door's locked. He's just kind of there like, what?
So, the fiction, the science fiction is more just the setting to tell the narrative. You see this in quite a few science fiction movies as well. Great example, amazing classic if anyone hasn't seen it, Ice Pirates. It's very good garbage, but the science fiction is just the setting for what is essentially a pirate, a kind of pirate, Caribbean pirates type movie, but they're in space and there's room for nights. You also you kind of get to things like Kroll, kind of bordering on this category in the 5th. And you must be thinking now if these things that just have no like waning consistency fall into category 4, what must be in category 5? Well, when you get to category 5, the things that I personally would put in there are the things that the science fiction is more the skin that you lay over it, and the rest of it is almost entirely just about the individual story. Like a great example of this is what's the science fiction series with what are they called, the people? No,
the culture.
The culture, yeah.
The one where they're at the tech point where they can just erase planets now.
Yeah, the people in this category, I'd say, they just kind of invent stuff that sounds like science. They're the real menace that makes science fiction kind of, soft science fiction really disliked by the hard science fiction people, because people come along and, just kind of invent anything they like with a massive buzzwords and just kind of let it happen.
We know someone who's done this as well.
Yeah, we know someone that likes to do that, and it's just not.
It really takes it out of the. It really takes it out of the realm of interesting, or in the case of like games, it just makes it unplayable. With them, and they just kind of have to be consigned to this special corner.
Yeah, it's the kind of settings where a lot of kind of animes kind of sit in this category as well. Like
definitely.
There's a manga about like this giant solar system sized sphere or something, and people just download their brains into things or whatever. Yeah, the science is just kind of a skin that's thrown over a story that people just kind of slap together. There are some of them that are quite good, like the one that has the culture in it. I can't remember its name. It's not a bad read. It's a book series. It's interesting, but as far as the science goes, it kind of falls flat. And then there's that other one that has like all those kind of colonial nation things. They're all in like 1950s rockets or whatever. The one that Pigeon.
Oh, I know what you're talking about. Hang on. It is called Foundation.
Yeah, Foundation. That's another one.
With your spy beams.
Yeah, the science just doesn't actually exist there. It's like a ghost of science that kind of obscures the not science.
There were people in there running around with coal-powered starships and things. It's like I'm sorry.
For the most part, not saying that we're trying to like rag on the people that's in that category. They can produce some quite interesting stories.
It's because it's a story-focused thing over the science-focused thing. Like if you're trying to build something for a more dynamic universe, you don't go on this end. And like if you're trying to play like a game, like a role-playing game or something.
It really comes down to if you're trying to make a story or if you're trying to make a universe with a story set in it.
Yeah, really.
Which I do believe then moves us onto our final point, the merits.
Yes. So the merits of
the bonuses and minuses for these two things. With hard science fiction, I would say there are more negatives than positives, but there's not as many. Like it's less extreme with the hard science fiction. You know, it's kind of say 2 to 1 on negatives to positives type thing, and I'll go over them in a second. But and that doesn't change a lot from one end of the scale to the other. It varies just a little bit. But on the soft one, it goes from, you know, barely any problems to there's more problems than you can actually count. So just going on the merits of the hard one. Well,
let's go positives first.
The more science realistic, which is always fun. You know, it's easier to work in for the most. It's kind of easier to work in because you can just use a lot of already existing stuff from our world in it. When you want to do anything more than what you can kind of just Google, you have to end up doing quite a bit of maths, which kind of adds to a negative. It also can be really hard to do, easy to work with, but hard to accomplish. A few other negatives with it is the space combat isn't particularly interesting, but you know it allows you to focus more on trying to make the characters more narrative based. Like what was it called, the space one you watch?
What, The Expanse?
Yeah, The Expanse does. The Expanse focuses like a lot on its characters and society, and it does it really well because you know it doesn't have to spend a mountain of time you know, trying to engineer these big massive space battles and stuff like that. So you spend a lot of time with the people. Another negative with real space is unless you're willing to bend the lines and go further to the like right of the scale from the middle, like if hard science fiction is left and soft is right, you have to go more to the right if you kind of want to do something on a larger scale. But if you're just doing like a cool small scale thing, like kind of like a red faction thing, you know, it's very nice. Particularly if you like military fiction. Military fiction fits very nice into the further left hard science fictions. And well, so that's pretty much all the ones I can think of. If you really like ground combat, going left can help quite a bit with that.
Nice.
And yeah, anything to add to that?
I'm trying to think. Let's just quickly run over the list. Is simplicity here. So we've got realistic or more functional. So you can everything's more grounded and you know what you're doing with it. We've got it's hard to pull off as a negative of that because you have to know what you're doing to pull it off.
Yeah.
a good character focus because it's hard to focus on anything else. And as a result of that, we've got low options for space combat because there are only like 2. There's drive at them with guns blazing, or shoot at them or pot shot them from the other end of the solar system. So metaphor.
Actually, one other thing to its bonus.
Yeah.
If you like things like space western type stuff or things with outlaws and criminals, real space is perfect for that because it's so large and it takes so long to get from places. You can't reasonably patrol or keep the entire place watched. So it's really easy to make any criminal kind of setting in that. Criminal, outlaw, rebellion stuff, it's super easy.
One other thing as well is it's not very, what do you call it? It's not very flexible if you want to do sort of unusual things with it. Like, like for anything quite far ahead on the scale, there's like no FTL and stuff. So you wind up with everything is confined to a fairly small space, but that space feels gigantic.
Yeah.
So
it's like being shrunk down inside of your house, opposed to having multiple houses.
Yeah.
And then for the soft science fiction, the pros and cons for that are, well, the pros are it's very flexible, it's easy to work in, well, it's easier to pull off, but it's harder to actually do, because if you really want your soft to do well, right, you got to at least do what like early Star Wars did and, put in a lot of explanation. That way there isn't a lot of these just gaping kind of questions.
Yeah. Oh yeah, no, yeah. Requires. We can put that as a negative. It requires more explaining than the other one does.
Yeah, because you're working on things that don't already exist some of the time. It requires a lot more explaining to do. So it's harder to do, easier to pull off.
I mean, personally, that's not much of a negative for me because I rather like explaining things.
Yeah.
You've taken the cake in this episode, though.
I definitely suggest, one of the big problems that kind of plagues the people that create in soft science fiction is all the people that kind of claim hand-wavium and stuff like that. My advice for that is, as long as your stuff either follows already set scientific principles, like thermodynamics, or you can explain it without a reasonable doubt, it more or less shouldn't be considered hand-wavium, at least.
Yeah. Well, yeah, like if you've explained it through to the point where you can, all of your things are pretty much like, you pick up a kettle or something, I know how to do that. Or you can figure out how to use your new principles to do things in the world. It's not hand-waving anymore. You're not just kind of, you're not kind of building the ultimate spoon and then saying this spoon can fly. And then giving some, like in Dune they have the Holtzman thing. I can't remember if it was called the Holtzman. I think it's called the Holtzman effect, which explains all of their fictional physics principles, but there was no explanation for it. So, or that if there was, it was very vague. So it could be used to explain everything, but not to, like, you couldn't get rid of the sort of "but how though" question.
Yeah. Well, that always ends up plaguing things that are fictional, because if it's real and tangible, people tend not to ask that question.
Yeah.
You could reasonably apply that question to, gravity and magnetic fields.
Oh, well, yeah, see, that's like my cutoff point when I'm making things is usually, once you get down to, like, subatomic scale, don't ask any more questions about how, because we already don't know.
Yeah,
we don't know why electrons do what they do. We don't know why they do it. We know how they do it, but we don't know why.
Yeah, we're kind of in that category where most of that's science fiction anyway.
Yeah. Like.
But yeah, so yeah, it makes the space combat interesting, and fighters become a thing, which is a lot of people really like the whole having fighters in space thing.
I know I do.
And one of the biggest things that at least the fluid space mechanics allow is coming from ground to space, because your ships are already built to have the ability to function within an atmosphere, and their engines are already built to way overcompensate for their size.
Although,
so they can already escape the atmosphere.
Well, yeah, there are exceptions to that. Like, obviously, you can't, depending on how you set it up, you can't just fly a jet plane into space, because that tends to require oxygen injection that a jet plane won't have. So you can't just use jets in space. That's not how that works. But if it's designed, if its engines are space worthy and you can reach the right speed, you can go to space fine. I mean, we didn't really cover that specifically, but mainly because it doesn't really need to be covered that much.
Most of that will be covered in the fluid space thing.
Yeah, that'll all be covered in another episode. I have no idea how long this has actually gone on for at the moment, but let's finish the list.
Yeah, pretty much the last few bits of the list is, in soft science fiction, you can make your narrative more open and interesting, so you can kind of just, Star Wars it. You can do a space opera type thing, or you can do a Mass Effect type thing. You just have more kind of just wacky science fiction things you have choices in. And actually, an interesting conclusion in this, going into the hard science fiction doesn't really have a bad end to it. It just has an overly serious end, where the soft science fiction has a bad end. Oh, well, a creatively bad end. Story-wise, they're fine, but science and, working on things, having things that work.
Yeah. The emphasis on things working isn't really there.
And I think the moral of this whole story is, create in either category you want, and don't criticize someone else's choices on them, because they might have reasons. But if they don't have reasons and can't explain their stuff, please criticize them until they can.
Yes, we condone questionings here.
Yeah, no one's above questioning.
Yes. Right. Well then, I think that settles that for this episode. Join us next time for the fluid space versus real space conversation. And see you then.
It'll be shorter than this one, hopefully.
Yeah. Right.